Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally here for my 2023 World Championships coverage on this channel. I'm very excited to finally be jumping in to a lot of these videos. I know some of you were expecting these to come out a little bit sooner. I do apologize. As you know, when I do make a lot of these videos, I have to go and watch, every single region, every single playoffs, and so I wanted to make sure that I got a good amount of knowledge on every team that was going to be at this tournament when I started making some of these videos. So we are finally here. It is finally time for some pre-Worlds coverage. Of course, we're going to be doing a variety of different videos as we go throughout this upcoming week, getting ready for the Worlds kickoff, the play-in stage kickoff in just a couple of days, about a week or so from now, and I'm very excited. But today, what we're going to be doing is doing my meta report video. This is something that's become a little bit of a staple on the channel for international tournaments over the past year. I did this at Worlds last year. I kicked that off there, and you guys really seem to like that video. I did it again at MSI, of course, this year, and so we're going to be running it back here for Worlds in this video. Essentially what we're going to do is go over some of the buffs, some of the nerfs that have happened in the time between the last games that were played domestically and the Worlds patch being 13.19. Gonna give some of my thoughts on what champions you can expect, what champions you should be looking out for as maybe the main threats of the tournament, and, whether or not some of the buffs or some of the nerfs are actually going to matter in terms of where these teams are at. Now, obviously, a little bit of a spoiler alert, the patches weren't entirely all that transformative in terms of where the meta is at, but still going to give a relatively good idea. Now, if you're waiting for other Worlds content, it's going to be out very, very shortly, within the next couple of days. Top 20 players is coming out, hopefully, in the next couple of days, and then, of course, not only my Worlds primer, but my play-in primer as well is going to be coming out very shortly as well. So we're going to be ranking all the teams, all the players. We're going to be giving predictions for how a lot of it's going to go. A lot of really good stuff. So stick around on the channel. But today, time to go over the meta. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Of course, what we're going to do is kick it off with our champion buffs segment. As you can see up on the screen, I'm going to highlight a few champions that got some buffs over the past few patches. Like I said, I'm going to mostly be referring to 13.18 and 13.19 in terms of the changes that were made, because those are the two patches that happened in between the last domestic games and the beginning of Worlds. LEC ended on 13.17, and so we've at least got a little bit of an idea of where the meta was on a patch like that. Going to be giving a little bit of an update. Of course, we're going to go over the buffs, the nerfs, and I'll kind of talk about each role individually at the end of the video. But let's start with the champion buffs. I'm not going to talk about every single champion that received any kind of buff. These are the ones that I think are going to be the most notable, if at all notable. We'll kind of talk about them each individually, but let's go ahead and start with the one that I think is probably the most interesting, at least in my eyes, and certainly the one that I think will increase the play rate of the champion the most, and that's going to be Gangplank up in the top lane. Now, on paper, I don't think an ultimate change for GP is really all that gigantic. It's really not something that's going to completely change how the champion plays. He's still going to have his strengths and his weaknesses, but as we've seen basically throughout the entirety of the history of pro play, especially in the last 5 or so years, when Gangplank is given basically any reason to be played, players are going to bring him out, and GP really was not a champion that was on a lot of teams' radars this year at all. I mean, a couple of teams were still pulling him out earlier in the year, but especially as the year went on, we saw less and less of Gangplank over the course of 2023, and I do think these changes actually do matter. Now, I don't really think that the cooldown matters all that much. We'll kind of talk about this a bit later. There are a couple ultimates in the game that I think are really good to have, as quickly as possible. CDR on some ultimates can be really good, but there are also champions where the ult matters a little bit more. It's a little bit more of a planning ult, something that you're not going to be quite as you're not going to be spamming Gangplank ult every single time it's off cooldown. I don't think the ult CD actually matters all that much. It's a good buff, but I don't really think that's, why Gangplank is going to get more play. To me, it's the slow and it's the movement speed buff on some of the upgrades that really do matter. They're actually pretty big changes and could really allow Gangplank to be a significantly better utility, kind of carry in the back half of the game. Obviously, we know he does enough damage, but if you can get cross-map ultimates that can give you these massive speed ups, these massive slowdowns on the enemy team, that's really, really big, and especially in team fights, if you're able to hit multiple members, that can really change the direction of an entire fight. And to me, this is the biggest change that's happened over the last few patches. I expect to see Gangplank at least a little bit at Worlds. I don't know if it's entirely going to change his outlook as a champion, but I do think of all of the champions that got buffed over the last 2 patches, his was probably the most impactful and the one that I would expect would increase the play rate of the champion more so than any of the others. But Let's go ahead and talk about the rest. The other champion that I think actually had like an okay change that I think might actually get some play because of it is Kennen. Also in the top lane, I think Kennen's another one of those champions that I think players want to go towards. You get so much lane pressure, and obviously the teamfight versatility, the ultimate's really, really good, and so to be able to get some cooldown buffs for Kennen, I think is a good idea. Now, again, very similar to what we just talked about with Gangplank, sometimes cooldowns don't really matter on, you know, big ultimates quite like Kennen's, where they're big teamfight changing ultimates, because you're not just spamming the ability. Yes, you know, I think a little bit more with Kennen than with Gangplank, you're going to try to use it on cooldown, especially towards the back half of the game, but it's not like a game-breaking thing, and I think really the change is going to be the E cooldown, at least in lane. Hopefully that's going to give him a little bit more pressure in the early game. His damage is fine right now, and obviously he's good in team fights. I do think we could see, you know, more Kennen. I'm not exactly going to predict that, as we'll see once we get into kind of the top lane section of this video, but I do think that the change to Kennen is interesting. I have Lissandra up on the top level as well. I really don't know how much this is going to change. The root duration on the W was buffed. I don't know if this is actually going to matter really at all. Lissandra's one of those champions that really isn't going to see a ton of play outside of being a counter pick in the mid lane, and unfortunately for Lissandra, a lot of the champions that she does really well into just aren't like the strongest in the entire game right now. When you're looking at the best mid laners in the game, none of them are really great matchups for Lissandra, and so, you know, I really don't think the W change is going to increase her viability all that much. We've been seeing a player like Mickey X bring her out in the support position there. You know, that's something I could see being a little bit more viable, especially if the root duration is going to be better, but overall, Lissandra still plays basically the same, and I still think she's going to be played in very similar situations. You've got Gwen getting a little bit of a change. It's kind of hard to talk about this because I don't actually know if this is going to matter even a little bit. I was actually even debating putting Gwen on this graphic at all. She basically got buffed in the jungle. Like, that was really the point of the changes. She does a little bit more minion damage now, which is, or I should say great monster damage, so she can clear a little bit faster. I don't think Jungle Gwen is going to make its way to Worlds, but if Gwen does turn into a flex pick, I would be remiss not to mention why on this page here. I mean, Gwen Jungle's really not been relevant over the past year or so. She's really just been a top laner, and she did receive kind of a general buff to her health scaling, which I think can be solid, especially with, you know, tanks being relatively fine in the top lane right now, especially Cassante, who is still very relevant, but I don't know. I don't think this change is going to matter. If we see Jungle Gwen, I'm still going to be pretty surprised, but it is something worth pointing out because it is at least a change to the champion. Thresh got a W shield buff. Sure, I mean, anything that really gives people a reason to play Thresh. I still think he's relatively weak in comparison to a lot of the other champions that kind of do his role at the moment. Now, nobody really does what Thresh does at the highest level, but when you're looking at not only other hook champions, but just engaged champions and, you know, champions that have a lot of good peel in the support position, there are just better options than Thresh, and I don't think this W change is really going to change that all that much. Syndra did receive a pretty decent Q damage buff, which I think could be intriguing. Obviously, with minion DMAT, you could clear wave really fast, especially towards the back half of the game when you can have 2 Qs out at a time. If you're able to just shove and get out on the map, that could increase a lot of the, I don't know, pacing and the tempo that Syndra is able to create in the mid game and really help out her ability to assist her jungler. We saw that used quite a bit on 13.17 by Fnatic, by Humanoid in particular, and, you know, if Syndra's only going to get better after that, I think that that is a positive for the champion. I think she's in a relatively similar spot, but again, very similar to what we talked about with, like, Gangplank or even, like, Kennen. Players like playing Syndra. They have a lot of practice on the champion, and generally speaking, Syndra does a lot, and so any sort of, you know, conditional buff, I think, is going to be a positive for her. We could see a little bit more play coming out from the champion. Lead W buffs are actually very interesting. The E change is very weird. Damage is going down, but overall, like, his damage is going up. But I actually really like the W changes where you don't really have to put any points in W anymore. You don't have to max W at all in order for it to be very relevant. It kind of just increases the mid-game power that Lee Sin is going to have. And, you know, generally speaking, I think this helps out lane Lee Sin quite a bit. This is a pick that, you know, I've been very high on over the past 2 years or so. I still think lane Lee Sin is very viable, specifically in the top lane, and I'm not necessarily sure we're going to see that at this tournament. If we had a player like Rascal at the tournament, maybe I'd be a little bit more confident that we'd be able to see, like, a top lane Lee Sin, but I do think it's stronger now than it has been at any point in the year, but it'll be interesting to see if Lee gets pulled out as a jungler. Obviously, the pocket pick in the jungle, buff, you know, Lee right around Worlds time. It's not a big surprise, but to me, this is mostly like a lane Lee Sin change, and I think it's very interesting that they ended up doing this. I've seen some people excited about the Jhin changes. Not really all that interesting to me. I think the R buff is good. Being able to do more damage, being able to fire faster is very solid, and, you know, Jhin's ultimate is a pretty good tool, especially in the mid game, to be able to clean up a lot of kills. It really helps him play weak side a lot better as that utility marksman, but he still kind of falls into some of the same problems that he's fallen into over the course of this year up until this point, which is the fact that there are a lot of really good hyper carry AD carries in the meta right now, and he's just not one of them. And if you're going to sacrifice a team slot in order to have a more utility-oriented AD carry, it's just typically not going to be worth it. It's very rare where you're going to look at a situation like that and feel confident about it. But I think if you do want to go towards a utility-oriented marksman, Jhin is a very good option at the moment. I just don't see a lot of teams wanting to go in that direction. And then finally, I have Galio on this graphic. He got a CD buff to his ultimate. This, to me, doesn't matter. I'm not going to say it's completely irrelevant, but, you know, because it is good to be able to move around the map maybe a little bit quicker, especially at levels like 8 or 9. But again, basically copy and paste what I said about the ultimates for champions like Gangplank and Kennen, where it's really good that you have that CD less, but you're very rarely casting Galio ultimate on cooldown. Like, there are very few situations where you are just, like, constantly moving around the map, constantly setting up Galio plays. You really want Galio ultimate when you need it, right? You're not going to be casting it all the time. And so, yes, like, lowering the cooldown does give you just a little bit more versatility in terms of how you can use that ultimate, but overall, I just don't think it really changes all that much. And that's kind of the big overarching theme, I think, of the buffs going into this patch on 13-18, 13-19, is they don't really do a whole ton, in my opinion. I think the Gangplank change is really the one where I think I'm going to be looking out for more Gangplank. I think that's probably the champion that's going to increase in play rate the most because people like playing Gangplank. I think the Syndra changes could matter. I think, obviously, any reason to get Thresh back in the meta could matter. I'd be interested to see if Kennen gets more play, if Gwen Jungle perhaps gets a game at Worlds, things like that. But overall, I would say that, you know, if you're just strictly looking at the buffs, not a lot has changed. Not a lot of champions that weren't viable have become viable. However, there are a few nerfs, and, you know, we'll go ahead and get into that when we get into the nerf section, that I think could raise some, you know, value and priority on some champions that haven't seen as much pressure over the course of this year, but I think it's going to have to come from champions that were buffed previously and not ones that were buffed on these upcoming patches that, you know, just recently happened. But then we move on now to the champion nerfs section of the video. Again, we're going to be going over 13.18 and 13.19 in terms of the nerfs, but only the ones that I feel are at the very least relevant towards pro play. I know that there are going to be a lot more solo queue changes that could end up mattering, but this is my estimation for the things that will end up at the very least going through players' heads when they're selecting some of the champions that they've been prioritizing over the course of the year up until this point. Basically, every champion that is in this champion nerf segment of the video up on screen right now has been played at a pretty high level over the course of this year. It's been very consistent, and they'll at least have to think a little bit more about selecting them in blind scenarios. So let's go ahead and talk about it. And probably the biggest change of the last two patches, in my opinion, the one that is going to affect pro play the most, is the LeBlanc nerf. And I don't know if a lot of people are going to be on the same page as me about that, but I think LeBlanc, a champion that has been very consistent over the course of this year, not necessarily ever being the highest prioritized mid laner, but something that I think a lot of players have felt really comfortable going to, especially as the year has gone on. We've seen more and more LeBlanc as a counter to, you know, some of these things, you know, with Azir being so blind pickable over the course of this year. LeBlanc doing very well into that matchup, I think, has really helped out a lot. I just think in general, LeBlanc has been, you know, pretty decent, not exactly broken or anything, but pretty decent, and I do think that the nerfs have hit her relatively hard. Essentially, a couple of changes. They've nerfed her mana, especially in the early games, that you basically have to buy a little bit more mana now in order to do her combo even remotely efficiently, especially in lane. They've nerfed her attack damage as well, and so when she's weaving in these auto attacks in lane, they're going to do significantly less damage. We've seen AD LeBlanc really start to take over quite a bit in solo queue, and I think a lot of players were expecting to see a little bit of that at Worlds. Not really going to happen here, especially with the changes, but they have slightly increased her AP, about 10% per combo, which is fine. It's good. It's a nice, you know, consolation buff, if you will, but I do think these changes hurt LeBlanc quite a bit, especially in the early laning phase, which is where LeBlanc really does want to generate some of her leads, and especially with the way that pro play kind of moves right now. Early laning phase is so important in the mid lane. Being able to establish tempo or being able to neutralize tempo from the other side, more importantly, is probably the most important thing that can happen in the game in the mid lane right now, and I think LeBlanc does that significantly worse. After these changes, I think people might look at the damage increase, the AP damage increase on these changes, and say that there is potential for her to do more damage, and yeah, that might be true towards the back half of the game, but especially when you're early on in the game, you're weaving in those autos, you're trying to pressure out the enemy mid laner, you don't really have nearly as much damage if your AD, if your auto attacks are doing less. That's a big part of her kit, and especially if she can't spam her abilities nearly as much with the mana changes. there's just a lot of problems, I think, with LeBlanc now. Now, is this enough to completely take her out of the meta? Probably not. I would expect LeBlanc to still be relatively, highly played because she always is. It's just LeBlanc. But do I think she's strong right now? No, I don't think that, I think these changes actually matter for her. One of the few changes over the last 2 patches that I do think actively changes how the champion wants to play the game. And I do think that LeBlanc is going to suffer because of it. Again, she's still going to get a lot of play at Worlds because players like playing LeBlanc. It's just one of those champions that's basically always going to be viable. We see Azir. We'll talk about him in a bit. He's in that same camp. But, I do think that her power is going to be weakened because of this, and I think it will increase some of the priority on some champions that maybe do have better matchups into her, or worse matchups into her where she can't quite, punish them nearly as much as she could before. But moving on to the other changes, I think basically all of the rest of them are fine at best and inconsequential at worst. Starting with Xayah in the bot lane, this is probably the other strongest quote-unquote change that happened over the last 2 patches. A bit of change to her safety and her health, her base health and her health scaling. This is fine. This is good. It gives you a little bit more punishment for playing really aggressive on Xayah, which just hasn't been the case in pro play over the course of this year. I like Xayah as a champion. It gives you a good amount of damage. It gives you a good amount of self-peel. It allows good players to look good, but I do think she has been a little bit too safe. She has too many options, and I think, the E change, I think, really matters. I think the health changes really matter. I think just giving her more punishment, more opportunities to be kind of capitalized on if she uses her abilities incorrectly, I think is generally a good thing. Now, do I think this is going to change basically anything about her play rate? Absolutely not. I just think that she's going to be a little bit more susceptible in the game. I think she's still going to get picked in a lot of the situations that she was getting picked in before, mostly because she still does everything that she did before very well. She's still a crazy high damage dealer at basically every phase of the game. She's very good in lane, one of the few AD carries in the meta right now that is genuinely, strong in lane and can do a lot in the early and the mid game, especially in comparison to a lot of the other ADs that she's going to be running into while still not, losing in the late game. She's still a hyper carry. She can still do a ton and scale up, especially if you win. And so I still think she's going to be pretty highly prioritized, but it is worth noting that maybe she isn't going to be quite as dominant in the games that she is picked in. Then you've got Azir, got a little bit of a cooldown nerf onto his Q. This should matter, but it won't matter. I think, obviously, his laning phase is going to be a little bit worse because of this. That's the entire point of the change. That's the entire point of what they've been trying to change about Azir over the past year, is they've been trying to make him worse. In the early game, they've been trying to make his poke worse, and the problem is just that it doesn't matter. Players are significantly too good at this champion, and the range that he has does make him significantly, more difficult to deal with than basically every other mid laner in the game if you can pilot him well, and so he's just going to be good. Anyways, I know that, people are waiting and waiting and waiting for Azir to just turn into this champion that needs to scale into the late game, that doesn't have the same kind of tools as a lot of the other mid lane champions. It's just not going to happen, and I don't think this change is going to change that all that much. Obviously, I do think it affects him. Again, very similar to what I said about Xayah, though. I think it's more so affecting him in-game in terms of how he ends up taking the trades rather than actually affecting his pick ban percentage. He's still going to be blind picked, and even though we're seeing an increase in things like the Xerath and, the artillery mages just in general, long-range poke mages, I still think that Azir is going to be highly prioritized because that's what mid laners at this tournament want to do, and so don't expect a major change in Azir play rate just because of this change, even if he is a little bit weaker, and that's basically the end of the changes that I think really matter. Rel got a little bit of a movement speed nerf on her E. It's going to be a little bit less consistent for her to be able to engage. They're trying to take her support power level in particular and lower that. She's still really good in the jungle. She's still going to be really good at support, and I think she's still going to be one of the highest prioritized and highest pick rate champions at the tournament. Renekton getting changes and getting nerfs, quote-unquote, before this tournament, I think is a good thing. He's been the top laner over the past 2 months, which he just kind of defaults to being when he's even in a remotely good spot, and so nerfing him before the tournament, I think, is fine, but it's a very weird nerf. It's just magic resist. He's just a little bit worse against AP champions now than he was before. He wasn't really getting any play rate in the mid lane before. I certainly don't think he's going to get any now, but I guess his matchup into some of the other top laners that are building AP at the current moment, things like Rumble, things like Gwen come to mind, Jax, come to mind. I think it's slightly worse, but it really doesn't matter. Renekton's still going to do the things that he does at an incredibly high level. It's another change that I don't think will affect his pick rate really at all for a champion that's been pretty universally picked over the course of this year. And then the final two, I think, really are just whatever. We'll talk about them very quickly. Zeri got a little bit of a movement speed nerf. It went down 5 points. Whatever. I don't think this changes the champion at all. We've said that before about 5 movement speed changes with champions like Aurelia, but I think specifically for Zeri, this is something that I don't think changes her at all. I think she's literally the same exact champion she was before the nerf. Now, I don't think that we're going to see any changes there. And then Jarvan, he got a little bit of damage taken off of his passive. Again, this, I guess, matters in the sense of you're doing less damage, but it's completely negligible. It's not why you're picking Jarvan in the first place, and this was already a champion that was kind of on the fringe of being picked. If you were going to pick Jarvan, you're still going to pick Jarvan. If you were already not going to pick Jarvan, you're still not going to pick Jarvan. This really doesn't change anything about the champion. He just does slightly less when he is picked, and I think that's kind of the over-encompassing thought that I have on a lot of these nerfs and a lot of these changes, with the exception, of course, of LeBlanc, where I do think that, you know, these changes might affect how these champions do end up operating once they're in the game, but they're certainly not big enough to change whether or not you would want to pick them for your team in the first place. Basically, every single one of these champions still does the same exact thing that they were picked for in the first place. Xayah is still going to be your most efficient carry, both early and late game, throughout the entirety of the game, the most consistent, if you will. Azir is still going to be Azir. He's still the best mid lane hyper carry in the game, and even if his lane is slightly weaker, it's still strong. Rel still has basically free engages so long as you have control of the map and can choose when you want to go in. Renekton is still going to bully basically everybody in the game, especially because most top laners have the most amount of experience on him. And then Zeri and Jarvan are still going to be relatively fringe picks that you can bring out if you need to. And generally speaking, I don't think the nerfs have changed much. I think, again, very similar to what I said about the buffs. It feels like Riot, over the course of 2023 in general, but specifically in the last, 3 months, has been allergic to major changes for the game. I don't know if they're planning something major for preseason, but this is the same meta that we had, 6 months ago. There really isn't a lot of difference other than a couple of champions being a little bit stronger and a couple of champions being a little bit weaker. If you watch the playoffs, in a lot of the regions, you kind of know what you're going to get here, and even if I do think there are a few changes, it's going to be pretty familiar to a lot of fans. But now that we've got the changes in the meta out of the way, it's time to jump into what I actually am expecting to see at Worlds this year. While I don't think that there was a tremendous amount of change in between the patches that we saw most recently in basically every region, or basically all year long, and what we're going to be getting on 13-19, I do still think there are some interesting things to talk about. And so, we're going to go position by position, talking about my tier 1 picks in each position, and then some tier 2 picks that I think will also infiltrate the meta, will be seen relatively frequently. Now, I want to make it clear, I do truly believe there are going to be more than just the champions that I mentioned here played at Worlds. I don't think that there will be any position that only has 6 or 7 champions played. I think we're going to get a variety just because I think a lot of different teams have different playstyles, especially considering some of the minor region teams really have established their own playstyles over the course of this year. I really figured that out watching tape, but these are the champions that I would expect to be the most common, and the ones that I think you probably have to think about in every draft phase. You don't want to pick something that is entirely susceptible to them, even if it's a tier 2 champion. I think tier 1 champions are going to be your blind pickable ones, the ones we're probably going to see most games either pick or ban. Not that they're all entirely broken, just that that's kind of how the meta has shaked out. And tier 2 is going to be more so for the picks that we're going to see every so often. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Of course, going position by position means that we get to start in the top lane. And top lane is a little bit of an easier discussion at the very least with tier 1. I only have 2 champions in my tier 1 in the top lane. It's the 2 champions that I think really have kind of shown themselves to be the most dominant, truly from pick percentage and just from how teams have prioritized certain champions in the top lane. There really is only one tier 1 top laner, and that is Renekton. But I do think that K'Sante definitely at least deserves an honorable mention in this spot, because I do believe that he still is one of the best top laners in the entire game. And I think when you look at a lot of the things that end up, hurting, quote-unquote Renekton, I think K'Sante just got stronger, right? K'Sante is just better and is probably going to be a little bit more versatile towards what he offers. The copy pasta is there for a reason, but these are pretty clearly the 2 best top laners in the game right now. Renekton is so consistent in terms of what he offers. You know how to play out a Renekton matchup. You know what you're supposed to do on a game-to-game basis. You're supposed to win lane. You can translate that into kind of this second-line bruiser in the back half of the game. A lot of people talk about, obviously, Renekton being this early-game champion that falls off super hard, but at the end of the day, he can still be very relevant. A point-and-click stun in the back half of a game is still very very valuable, and especially because you can build him relatively tanky. He can be a problem towards the back half of games, maybe not nearly as much as some of the other top laners that are going to scale, kind of in that same vein, like an Aatrox or a Jax that we'll get to a little bit later, but I still think Renekton is just a very versatile pick, and even if I don't think he's the strongest top laner in the entire game, every top laner in the world seems to think that he's the strongest top laner in the game. I mean, look at the LPL, look at the LCK, look at the LEC, look at the LCS. All of them are prioritizing Renekton over every other top laner. It's not really ever getting banned, but it's pretty much always getting blind picked in basically every region, and so if you're not a fan of Renekton, I'm sorry, nothing about the changes over the past few patches is going to affect that, really. And then, like I said, I still think K'Sante deserves to be considered tier 1. I think this champion is somehow underrated in terms of power level at the current moment. I really don't think a lot has changed about K'Sante. I see Renekton as that priority, you know, power pick that everybody's going towards, but I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think K'Sante is just as versatile and gives you just as many options. Now, he does have a few more, like, direct counters, but I would consider these the two best top laners in the game, and really the only two that I'm expecting to see in like 75+% of pick ban phases at Worlds. And then moving on to tier 2, I have a bunch of champions listed here for tier 2. I think that there are a lot of options in the top lane for maybe if you want to go outside of those top 2, or if you want to ban out the Renekton and you want to go for something else, perhaps try to counter the Renekton with some of the magic resist nerfs that he just got over the course of the last few patches. I do think that there are some options. The AP threats that you kind of need to point out, Rumble obviously going to be kind of chief among them. Rumble is still pretty strong. The nerfs a couple of patches ago did hit him, you know, relatively hard, and he can be relatively susceptible to being outscaled and just not being in a good position if your team is losing, but he's very consistent as a team fight threat. He can do really well in lane as well. And then again, like I said, if Renekton is going to be the most common top laner in the game, if you do have a situation where, you know, his MR is now nerfed, then Rumble could be the champion that takes advantage of that the best. The other AP, or I guess quote-unquote AP champions that are going to probably have a better time in that matchup are Gwen. Gwen does really well into K'Sante as well, or at least that's what everybody keeps telling me, even though I never see it on tape. Every single time those two lane against each other, it seems like the K'Sante is just ahead. So yeah, I get it. Like, I get why Gwen is supposed to be better as that tank shredder, but she should be a lot better into the Renekton now as well. And again, potentially could be a jungle option. And then the Jax as well, I think, has to be considered in that same vein. Obviously not an entirely AP champion, but enough AP in the kit to be able to bother a champion like Renekton if those nerfs do end up going through. And I think Jax in general might be the champion that I am most willing to consider in that tier 1 if things were to end up working out. I think of all of the champions listed here, in tier 2, I think Jax has the highest percentage chance of just being something that's played a whole ton. I think everything else is a little bit more situational, even something like the Rumble or the Gwen. Other bruisers that you can talk about being Aatrox, being Gnar, these are champions that are, you know, conditionally going to get picked up. Aatrox still does his Aatrox things. We've seen certain players really prioritize him, but with the popularity of Renekton, it really does feel like Aatrox is just kind of a secondary choice for a lot of top laners at the current moment still. He'll probably get some play at this tournament. Gnar is really interesting as a pick. I like Gnar quite a bit. And again, there are a couple of top laners at this tournament that really prefer him as a champion, and so definitely, at the very least, have to point him out in the video. And then you have champions like Gangplank. Talked about GP earlier. Could definitely see some increase in play with the changes to the ultimate, with the buffs to the slowdown, to the movement speed buff when you do get those upgrades. I think Gangplank's fine. I think he's in a relatively decent spot. He's Gangplank. If you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of early pressure, he can still carry games very easily in the late game, and especially in comparison to the past few years, I think there are more carry top laners just generally in the world right now that can take advantage of a champion like Gangplank. So could expect to see him a bit more, and then you've got some more tank, you know, oriented options, some safer options like the Ornn, like the Poppy, which is a flex pick that I'm going to talk about a little bit later as well. But Ornn, I think, is still going to be your premier, like, AFK tank. K'Sante definitely fills that role, and so I wouldn't expect to see Ornn picked over something like K'Sante. But if it's not available to you and you want to go for something a little bit more defensive on the top side, Ornn is still incredibly consistent, even if tanks aren't, like, dominating the current meta. And then Poppy, I think, again, as a flex pick, just offers you a lot of value. I'd be remiss not to put it here, but those are the champions in the top lane. Really not a lot of other ones that I considered for this list, but these are probably the main ones that I would expect to see. And then moving on to the jungle role now, I think this one has been a little bit more solidified over the course of this year. You know, top lane, I think, has been very much defined by a couple of champions, whereas I think jungle has been defined mostly by the playstyle and the champions that can execute that playstyle at the highest level. And again, unfortunately, I don't really see a lot changing and a lot adapting from what has been going on over the course of this year in this tournament. So let's go ahead and talk about the tier 1s up on the screen. I've got 4 champions in tier 1. I've got Ivern, I've got Maokai, I've got Sejuani, and I've got Rel. I still think these are the 4 best jungle champions in the game. I personally believe that Ivern is the strongest jungler in the game right now. I think Ivern has been the strongest jungler in the game for quite a while. I don't think every team is going to be able to pilot Ivern at the level that he needs in order to really succeed, and it's not really a talent thing, it's more so a playstyle thing. You need your jungler to be willing to play Ivern and to give over resources to be more of a kind of roaming support, but I think if your team is set up to be able to pilot Ivern and to be able to play around mid lane or play around bot lane in an incredibly accelerated, fashion, then I think a champion like Ivern is just better at getting those champions ahead than anybody else in the game. And especially with how strong bot lane is at the current moment, you add in an Ivern to a potential roaming support or a roaming mid laner, I should say, and just try to get your hyper carry super fed. It can be a really quick strategy in order to generate consistent leads if you're better than the other team. And so for me, Ivern is still going to stay at the top of tier 1. And then the rest of tier 1 is just all of the tank engaged junglers that we've become incredibly familiar with over the past year or so. Maokai kind of spearheading that charge, definitely the one that is going to be the most consistent, but I really don't see a gigantic difference in what Maokai or Sejuani or Rel will offer you. Now, they're good at different parts of the game. I think Maokai is probably your best, late game team fighter, certainly your best zone control champion with, the ultimate and obviously with the saplings. If you want to build him AP, you can. If you want to build him full tank, you can. He does give you a bit more, flexibility, a bit more options than the other two do, but I don't think he's necessarily, dominant in terms of the, the same way that he had been earlier on in the year. I still think he's a good jungler and certainly will probably be the most played jungler at this tournament because, again, like I said, even if I consider Ivern to be the strongest jungler at the tournament, I don't think every team is going to go for him. I think every team is going to be willing to go for Maokai. I think he does, basically everything that you could want a jungler to do. He's clear as fast, he's incredibly consistent, and he's probably the best late game team fighter, like I said, but Sej and Rel do offer kind of a little bit of a different style in terms of that. Sej is just, super CC heavy, probably going to be a little bit better in terms of, direct front-to-back team fighting. I love Maokai, but if you're not going to play around, objectives and you're not going to play around picks, then it's a little bit more difficult. I'm not going to say more difficult, but Sej has a little bit of an advantage just, running at the enemy team, throwing out the ultimate, and, locking down a couple of targets. I think Sej is really good at that, almost underrated at that at the current moment, and I still think she's going to get a lot of play. I like Sejuani as a champion, even if she has fallen off a bit since the beginning of the year. And then Rel, probably the most feast or famine of these options, still very consistent, but when you're comparing it to Maokai or Sejuani, Rel has the opportunity to be significantly more oppressive to play against. If you're going against a Rel that has generated a lot of leads in the early game and has gotten gold on a lot of her carries, that game's basically over. There's really not a lot that you can do in those instances. Rel is one of those champions where when you get to play Rel from ahead, the engage feels basically completely free. I don't think the movement speed changes are going to affect her all that much, but Rel is one of those champions where if you play her from behind, if you don't get that lead, if, your laners are starting to get pushed in, you don't really have a lot of backup options in terms of how to play the game. You really are just a go-in champion, kind of like Leona in the sense of, if Leona is behind in levels, what's she gonna do? Not go in? That's the whole kit. Same thing for Rel. If Rel is behind in levels, if Rel is behind in tempo, you're going to need to look for picks because you're not going to be able to do anything other than try and engage. And so while Rel can give you, even more of an upside than any of the other champions at this level, I do think that obviously the consistency isn't quite as much there. Now, it's still really good because the engage in general is really good, even if you're playing from behind, but we're comparing her to Maokai and Sejuani, who are crazy consistent at what they do, and so that's going to be my tier 1 for the jungle. I think those are the 4 best champions, and then moving on to tier 2, just a couple of other playstyle options. There are plenty more junglers that I think could be thrown in to this conversation, but these are kind of the archetypes that I think I wanted to talk about a bit more. Viego is really the one champion that I think you can make an argument for being in tier 1. We always see an increase in priority in champions like Viego as we get closer to Worlds because of his flexibility. We know obviously that he can carry the late game, and once you start the snowball on Viego, it does get a little bit out of control, but he's more versatile than basically any other jungler in the game. He's good at all phases of the game, early, mid, and late. He's incredibly efficient. He can be a little bit more supportive, but again, he can carry. If you want to put, your best player in the jungle on something like that, then, it's going to be fine. Viego is definitely a champion we're going to see a lot of, and then everybody else a little bit more up and down. A couple of these are included because of certain players at Worlds. Someone like Taliyah, obviously we've seen a ton of it come out from Fnatic and from Razork. I still think that Taliyah is probably your I don't want to say premier AP jungler because I do think that there are quite a few options, but Taliyah is pretty strong in that role, and especially with the increased prio that we're seeing her in the mid lane, I could see that being more of a popular flex. Poppy, again, flex pick, just going to be a little bit more consistent. I don't know how much we're actually going to see her at this tournament, but I felt remiss to not put her on the list, and so she's going to be on the list for both top and jungle, even if I'm not entirely sure that we're going to get a ton of her at this tournament. Nocturne is something we've seen a lot of priority with, things like the Nico, things like backline divers, trying to set up these wombo combos, especially with Levy at the tournament for Gam. You're kind of expecting this Nocturne to definitely come out at least a little bit in the play-in stage, but I've never been a huge fan of this Nocturne pick across this year. In fact, I've pushed a lot of people away from it in terms of, what I've talked about. I think it's definitely kind of bait at the current moment. You're oftentimes just trading 1-for-1, and most of the time that's not really worth it in comparison to what you can get out of some other junglers in the meta right now, but Nocturne still does what he does, probably better than any other jungler in the game. And then Jarvan, again, the nerfs happen, but they're basically irrelevant towards what he wants to do. He's still going to be able to go in, he's still going to be able to make things happen. Now, the champion that I think a lot of people aren't seeing here that I think could potentially be here is Bel'Veth. I think there is a potential for Bel'Veth to be, relatively popular. Yikes going to this tournament. There are definitely a couple of Bel'Veth players that are, at Worlds this year, but I'm just not sold that Bel'Veth is really all that strong, and I really don't think that there are going to be a lot of opportunities and circumstances where I'm going to pick a champion like Bel'Veth over the consistency of an engaged jungler or over something like a Viego, which I think is just going to be a little bit more consistent in terms of how the game plays out. That's not to say we're going to see zero Bel'Veth. I expect to see at least some, but probably not enough for me to include it on this list. But I would say if there is a snub, quote-unquote, on this graphic, it probably is Bel'Veth, and that's definitely something worth pointing out. But overall, I think the jungle meta is going to be relatively similar to what we've had. I think, champions like Karthus could potentially sneak their way in, but it's mostly going to be those engaged junglers, and then if you do deviate from that top 4, it's going to be, some combination of one of these skill sets. Either, late game carry like Viego, AP jungler like Taliyah that's basically there to help out your damage diversity, a diver and Nocturne, or Jarvan that can help out in the early game. Something like that. One of those archetypes is going to be filling it if it isn't an engaged jungler, but we're probably going to be seeing a lot of engage coming out from the jungle position just like we have all year. And then moving on now to the mid lane. Mid lane's been a little bit weird over the course of this year. There really hasn't been as established of a meta in the mid lane, at least at the beginning part of the year. We've really started to get closer and closer to something that is kind of universal across all the regions, across a bunch of different team playstyles, but I still think of all of the positions and of all of the roles in the game right now, mid probably still has the most flexibility in terms of how it wants to play. So I am going to list some options here. Obviously, that's what the point of this is, but I think it probably is the most expansive, and there will be multiple picks that are not listed here that I'm sure are going to get a good amount of play. But let's go ahead and start it with Tier 1. Tier 1 to me are the champions that are going to be consistently played over the course of the tournament. These are the champions that have kind of proven out to be the most consistent from a game-to-game perspective. I think there are obviously a lot of other options, but these are the ones that I would expect to see the most of. Perhaps a lot of bans coming their way, which we'll talk about with a couple of these champions in particular, but my Tier 1 is going to look like Tristana, Jace, Azir, and Ahri. I think they're the 4 champions that you really have to look at as kind of the meta-defining mid laners in the game right now. The 2 AD mid laners that have really dominated over the course of this year, of course, Tristana and Jace, for very different reasons. I think both of them establish a lot of tempo early and can move around the map, but they kind of take that tempo and do different things with it. Jace much more of that like poke mage, and he can carry in the late game, but is much more going to be used to establish tempo for the rest of your team, specifically your bot laner in the mid game. And we've seen that be incredibly successful. We've seen him paired up with a lot of Kai'Sa and things like that to make these big, long-range artillery combos, and Jace in general just offers a ton of different options. He hasn't really been taken out of the meta in a way that I think would really affect him all that much at Worlds. And then my personal pick for the best mid laner in the game right now is Tristana, and it really has been over the course of this entire year. What does Tristana not do in the current meta? That's kind of the thing with her. I know a lot of people, really the biggest negative I would say for Trist is that, she's AD. And that can be a little bit of a problem in the mid lane every once in a while when you don't have a lot of AP damage on the rest of your team. But there are a lot of, champions and carries in the bot lane that can bring out some AP things. Kai'Sa obviously most notably, but we've seen some Ryze and Kog'Maw. We've seen, Ziggs get flexed down there, Karthus get flexed down there. And you've also got some junglers that are more than happy to build more AP. Things like the Maokai obviously have been paired a lot with the Tristana, or if you wanted to go something more aggressive like the Karthus or the Taliyah in the jungle, that's definitely a possibility as well. But Trist, I think, just gives you the most amount of options for what you want to do. She dominates the early laning phase. There are very few champions in the game that can actively deal with her early, and there really isn't any other mid laner that snowballs nearly as hard as Tristana does in the current meta. And so if you are able to get that lead, and if you do really feel like you're the better player and you're able to outplay and move around the map and create a lot of, chaos and havoc, like, you can carry games single-handedly from the mid lane spot with Tristana, which I just don't think is nearly as easy with any other champion in the game at that role right now. And so Tristan, Jace are definitely going to be the two that you're going to have to look out for the most, but they're a little bit more high variance. Like, I don't want to say carry-oriented, because Jace isn't entirely a carry-oriented pick. It can do quite a bit, but, Tristana is definitely more carry-oriented, and if you don't want to play around your mid lane nearly as much, perhaps you want to go for something that can be a little bit more supportive in one way or the other. Azir definitely comes to mind. I know we got nerfed, but I really don't think it's going to matter. Yes, his laning phase continues to get weaker and weaker, but his late game is still incredibly strong, and honestly, his early game isn't all that bad, even with some of the nerfs, and so I still expect him to be a tier 1 pick at Worlds, especially because, let's face it, this is what mid laners played for a majority of the year. They're going to pull it out at the biggest tournament when their seasons are on the line. Azir still is really, really consistent. Like I said, doesn't need a ton of resources in order to be very good, will just be solid, and obviously can carry games towards the back half. We've seen him in more of a playmaking role over the course of this year than maybe we have in other years. A lot of people looking for flashy Shuriman shuffles. I've been pretty negative towards some of those plays. I think Azir as just like this backline marksman carry in the back half of games can like single-handedly win team fights, but you can playmake on the champion if you need to, can kind of fit into whatever comp you need to run around him, and so very versatile. We'll still see a lot of play. Same thing for Ahri, probably the best, like, roam-oriented mid laner in the current meta, in terms of if you want your mid laner to be more of this shove and roam style where it's not really all about laning phase, you want to get your jungler and your mid together and moving around on the map to try to make these more macro-oriented plays. Ahri's probably the best in the game at the current moment for that, because Ahri doesn't really need a lot of resources, and that's really what's kind of propped her above a lot of the mid laners that do something similar in the meta right now. I think Ahri's just kind of better at it because of how, little she needs in order to get to the point where she can be really effective in that role. And so still really like Ahri. I still think these four are going to be the most dominant in terms of their position, but like I said at the beginning, I really do think that mid lane is probably the most vast and versatile of the roles in order, for what champions are going to get played and which are going to be prioritized. And so when we look at tier 2, I do have a couple listed here, but I think there are a lot of other options that could be pulled out as well. Again, very similar to what I said about jungle, this is more of an archetypes type of thing. If you have certain champions that you feel as a team you're more confident on in these certain roles, I think that they could definitely, apply here as well. And we'll kind of talk about some of them when we get to the back half. Let's start with LeBlanc. I know she's in the middle of the list, but she's kind of the one that's dropped down to tier 2. She's been tier 1 all year long, really has been super highly prioritized. The pick ban percentages are incredibly high, most of that being bans. Players and teams just don't want to go into LeBlanc. It's very difficult to actually play into that champion at a super high level because of just how safe she is and how consistently she's able to deal her damage. But like I said, her early laning phase is much weaker on this patch, and I do think it's going to matter when it comes to her pick percentage. Now, maybe she does continue to be a tier 1 pick, and I certainly wouldn't expect her to fall anywhere close to out of tier 2. I think she's still going to get quite a bit of play, even quite a few bans at this tournament, but if I had to guess, I would say that of all of the champions to get hit over the past few patches, hers is going to hit the hardest in terms of the pick ban percentage. I think she will move down to tier 2 instead of being one of the clear-cut top ones in the game, but still, LeBlanc's great. Like, LeBlanc still does everything you want a mid laner to do, especially as an assassin. Then you've got some more combo-oriented style champions. You've got things like the Taliyah. Kind of does what Ahri does, but in my opinion, a little bit weaker now. Taliyah is a little bit of a flex pick, though, and so if you wanted to move it into the jungle, that could definitely be an option for some teams. That could raise her popularity, her viability, if you will, enough for me to put her on this list. Talked about Neeko when we were talking about Nocturne. Neeko's seen a ton of play over the course of this year after her rework. Can be very interesting to play. I don't think she's nearly as strong as she was at the beginning of the year. One of the champions that I think has been hit the hardest by some of the nerfs over the course of this year, but still is pretty viable, especially if you've taken the time to practice her. I mean, the headaches just alone that you can cause playing as Neeko are probably worth the price of admission alone. If you're able to land a 3 or a 4-man ultimate and you have some damage to follow up on it, it can be a game wipe. Like, you can win basically any team fight from any position with that circumstance. The problem typically is that Neeko isn't a solo carry. She's not going to be able to single-handedly win you games. You can hit a 4-man ultimate, and if the rest of your team is super far behind, it doesn't really matter. So, you know, Neeko's still good and can definitely create a lot of problems. We're definitely going to see her, but not the strongest champion in the game anymore like she was earlier this year. And then some other champions. Syndra is going to be kind of my token, like, safe mage. You could put Orianna on this as well. I think both of them kind of fulfill similar roles, just in very different ways. I think both of them are going to be picked as more comfort picks, more, I don't want to say blind picks, but specific matchup kind of things. I think Syndra is going to be a little bit more viable, in my opinion, than Orianna. I like Ori. We'll talk about her in a second, but I think Syndra is really solid right now. I think that you can basically play her in any matchup. I know that, you know, everybody on this list has kind of different strengths and weaknesses. Syndra doesn't really have a ton of weaknesses. She doesn't really have the same amount of strengths, but she can still dominate team fights. That ultimate's still going to do a ton of damage. She can still move around the map. Her wave clear got better, and so if you want to try to play for these mid-game power spikes, you can do that. You have a lot of good gank assists. Syndra's just really solid. You don't need me to tell you why Syndra is a good champion. And then I have Xerath listed here. We've seen a really high priority jump, I guess a spike, if you will, in Xerath play over the last few weeks, the last month or so, and I think that will continue into Worlds, especially with a couple of the picks that are continuing to be popular. I'm not sure where I land on Xerath just yet in terms of, you know, him as a champion. I think, obviously, he does a ridiculous amount of damage. It can be really oppressive to play against in the early laning phase, as we've seen. Most of the time, we see Xerath winning. Basically, every single time we've seen this champion pulled out, he's doing a ton of damage. It's really, really active on the map, but Xerath very rarely wins games, and I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that if you're relying on Xerath in the early game, you're not necessarily getting something that can scale nearly as dominantly into the teamfight stage, and you know, we've seen that become a little bit of a problem. I'm willing to chalk that up to more of a statistical outlier, but it is worth noting that Xerath hasn't exactly been the most productive of champions when he has been played over the past few patches. I do think artillery mages are in a really good spot right now, whether that's Xerath, whether that's Ziggs, you know, whoever you want to put in that spot. I think that, you know, there are a lot of options in the mid lane for being able to take advantage of a champion like Azir, who did get nerfed with those picks, but you know, I don't know if I necessarily would consider them the strongest in the game. So overall for mid, like I said, a lot of different playstyles, a lot of different options. You could include a champion like Yone on this list. You could, you know, include a Orianna, like I said. There are a couple of different types of champions that I think are, at the very least, worth pointing out that we will, at the very least, see like once or twice at Worlds, but these are probably the champions that I would expect to more so define the ideologies of how teams want to go about draft in the mid lane. But it's really cool to see a mid lane meta where I think, you know, outside of Tristana and Jace, who I just think are incredibly strong, it is relatively versatile. And then moving on to our bot lane meta now. We've only got the final two bot lane positions to go over, and these are probably some of the more straightforward ones, where I think that mid lane and jungle have a couple options, a couple archetypes that you can fit into. I do think ADC and support are going to be a little bit more locked in towards what we're seeing. I still think there is a little bit of flexibility, which we'll get to specifically in the support position, but let's start it off with our AD carries. Our marksman position up on the screen is our tier 1. Gonna be 4 ADCs in tier 1, and I think unlike a lot of the other roles where I was talking about how we're gonna get a relatively decent variety of champions in those roles, specifically like mid lane, top lane, you know, we're not gonna get the same champions in 90% of games. I don't think that's the case for AD carries. I don't think a lot of these champions are gonna be pulling a ridiculous amount of bans. And I think generally speaking, in probably 80 to 85% of games, it's going to be 2 of these 4 AD carries going up against each other, just kind of depending on how each team wants to play the game. That typically is how it is with marksmen. But I think even more so this year, the best marksmen just kind of feel a little bit more consistent than everyone else. We'll talk about some other ones that I think can fall into that category as well. But tier 1 is Kai'Sa, it's Xayah, it's Zeri, and it's Aphelios. And I think generally it's been a top 3 for most of the year. It's been Kai'Sa, Xayah, and Zeri. They've kind of been the 3 dominant AD carries. Of course, Zeri has had her dominant days in the past, but she's still really good. I think she's in a really good spot right now in terms of pro play. I think that she's really rewarding towards really good players. When you are the better player, I think Zeri makes it, you make Zeri look really strong when you're the better player. I think that's a pretty easy way to put it. But I don't think she's nearly as strong as Kai'Sa and Xayah are at the current moment. Of course, Xayah receiving minuscule buffs, mostly to survivability, but the damage is still absolutely there and the consistency is there. But it's hard to talk about the marksman meta right now without bringing up Kai'Sa first and foremost. Kai'Sa, for a good reason, has been the most prioritized marksman of the year, and especially towards the back half of the year, once Zeri did receive those nerfs, Kai'Sa really has been untouched as the #1 AD carry in the meta because of the versatility. You can go AD, you can go AP, you can be super artillery focused, you can dive the backline. You can kind of do a little bit of all of it if you really want to. Now, I don't think Kai'Sa is nearly as strong as some people might make her out to be. We see a lot of comments about how Kai'Sa is this ridiculously broken champion that has no counterplay. That's not how I see Kai'Sa. I don't think Kai'Sa is that champion. I just think she's really good, and she gives you a lot of options for how you want to play the rest of your game. She might not be the most dominant AD carry we've ever seen. She's not as strong as peak Zeri was, or even peak Kai'Sa earlier this year, but she's still going to be very valuable, and I would imagine the highest pick ban champion at Worlds, just in general. I imagine it to be close to 100%. And then for Xayah, again, got hit a bit in terms of survivability, but the damage and the consistency is so strong, and quite frankly, it's the best in the role that I think it's going to be fine. Her early game is just really good. Look at the other champions that are in Tier 1. Kai'Sa, Zeri, Aphelios, none of these champions are really all that good in the early part of the game. They're really not fast, and they don't like to skirmish. And I think Xayah loves to skirmish. She's going to be, especially in comparison to the rest, very, very quick, and champion that I think is just naturally going to be able to develop a ton of priority in the bot lane. So if you do want to play around dragons, if you do want to play, you know, for your jungle for the most part, I think Xayah is actually probably the best AD carry in the game to pick in that spot. I think she's still going to be really strong. I think she's still going to be picked a lot. I would expect Kai'Sa and Xayah to kind of be the two highest priority bot laners. I still have Zeri in this top 3. Movement speed nerf is completely irrelevant. It's not going to change the champion even a little bit. Again, like I said, sometimes you can get those movement speed changes that completely change how a champion plays or the aggressiveness that you can play with a champion, but it's just not going to matter for Zeri in particular. She's still going to be the same champion she's been over the last few months, which, like I said, is a good champion, something where if you're a really good AD carry, and specifically if you are much better than who you are playing against, it's going to look like the most overpowered champion of all time because she's never going to be hit. She's going to deal infinite damage and she's going to 1v9. Right? Like, that's Zeri when she's at her absolute best, but when you're not as good, like, you can't really punish nearly as hard on Zeri as a champion. That's why I feel pretty confident with where she is at the current moment in the meta. I think she's going to stay in a very similar place. We're going to see good teams do well, and bad teams do poorly on Zeri. A lot of bad teams have honestly just kind of opted out of picking Zeri in the first place, and then Aphelios has kind of worked his way into this tier 1 for me, mostly because I just don't feel super confident that the other 3 are, like, ridiculously dominant at the current moment, and this was one of my big takes last year in my meta report. Nobody was really talking about Aphelios going into the tournament. A lot of people were talking about, like, the increase in Caitlyn and Kai'Sa and things like that at the time, and I said, no, I'm pretty sure Aphelios is going to be the top-played AD carry. You know, I think that the meta had really evolved into a place where Aphelios could really capitalize on some of the things that were happening, and I think it's very similar here, where I think he's just very consistent at what he does. He's a great late game hyper carry. He's pretty safe in the early game, specifically with a lot of the supports that he does end up getting paired with. And, you know, a lot of these AD carries just have a ton of time on him, and I think that that's really going to matter a lot. I think he's going to work his way pick ban-wise into this tier 1, even if he isn't necessarily on the same power level as something like a Xayah, in my opinion, which is just a little bit of a better version of him. I think you give a little bit more options. I still think Aphelios is going to get a lot of play. And like I said earlier, I think 80+% of the games that we see at Worlds are probably going to include 2 of the champions that you're seeing in tier 1 on this list right here, but it is at least worth noting that there are a couple of other tier 2 champions, if you will, in the bot lane, and they're up on the screen now. Sivir, Ezreal, Kalista, Kog'Maw. I think all of these champions have niches that they can get played in, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're nearly as strong. Now, the one champion that I think could make their way into that tier 1, you know, just based off of comfort and based off the playstyle, is Ezreal. We've been seeing an increased priority in Ezreal in basically every region across the past few months. We saw this as a champion that really was getting 0 play at the beginning of the year, and then month over month over month, Ezreal just continued to climb in terms of where teams were going. We've been seeing some really good performances, but kind of similar to what I was talking about with Zeri, although in a very different way. Ezreal's one of those champions that I would very much recommend you don't pick if you're the underdog, if you do not feel like you are mechanically the better player. I feel like Ezreal very much needs great execution in order to work. Now, when you execute greatly on Ezreal, it looks fantastic, and you can absolutely dominate and take over games, but, you know, I think it's going to be more of a niche pick than people give it credit for. The rest of them are a little bit different. Kog'Maw, we've seen a rise in popularity, specifically on 13-17 in the LEC. We saw a lot of teams start to move towards this kind of protect the Kog'Maw comp. I do think we're going to see a bit of it at at Worlds. I don't think it's going to take over the game or anything like that, but it's certainly something that I would expect to see, and I do think is relatively strong right now. I think there are a couple supports that pair incredibly well with Kog'Maw that are very good in the meta, and I think that just in general, this engage jungle style with more of a weak side top, or, you know, kind of an isolated top, if you will, and then a roaming mid laner is just generally good for Kog'Maw. I think this is a meta that he can thrive in, and then you've got picks kind of opposite ends of the spectrum here with Sivir and Kalista. Kalista going to be more of that lane dominant pick if you want to be able to win early, if you want something that's going to be more consistent at being able to beat something like Xayah. If you're worried about losing pressure in the early game, I think Kalista is probably the go-to option, in my opinion, for that at the current moment. And then if you just want to AFK farm until 3 items and try to hyper carry towards the back half, Sivir is definitely still an option. I'm definitely a little bit lower on Sivir as a pick. We've seen teams continue to go towards her, and she's probably the most played over the course of this year out of these 4, but I think she's probably the weakest. I'm just not a big fan of champions that take that long to be able to get online. However, if you are going to be able to get away with it, a meta where Kai'Sa and Zeri and Aphelios are like the main AD carries, it's probably the meta to be able to get away with that. And so these are the 8 AD carries that I would expect to see most games. If like 95+% of games, it's going to be, you know, some combination of those 8 AD carries. I guess champions like Ashe or Jhin or, you know, I don't know, really any other marksman, Karthus, even Ziggs, could make their way into the meta. It's definitely possible. Draven probably deserves to be, at the very least, a shout-out on this list because of what he can do in the early game, but I think for the most part, it's going to be these 8 champions that kind of dominate the bot lane, and I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of the priority that certain teams take on these champions. And then finally, we get to move into the support position here. I think that support is in a very interesting spot because it's very clear that there is a specific playstyle that continues to be favored amongst a lot of the pros and honestly is stronger than the other at the moment. Of course, that being engaged supports. However, I do believe that Enchanter supports are kind of being slept on at the current moment. They are significantly more viable than people are giving them credit for, and I even think kind of Protect comps are pretty good at the current moment, and so gonna see a little bit of that when we go over some of the meta, but Tier 1 is up on your screen. Now, I've got 5 champions in my Tier 1. This is the only role and position where Tier 1 is larger than Tier 2, which we will get into, but that's because I think these 5 champions are going to consist of most of your games, very similarly to what I said about the AD carries. I think bot lane is in a pretty locked spot at the current moment, or at least that's how it feels going into the tournament. And I think these 5 definitely feel like a cut above everybody else. So let's go ahead and go over it. My 5 champions in Tier 1 are Alistar, Nautilus, Rell, Rakan, and Braum. Now, I was very hesitant on putting Braum in this list, but I think he deserves to be here, very similar to what I was saying about Cassante. Even if he hasn't necessarily been prioritized in the same way that the other Tier 1 champions have been, I still think he's strong. So let's talk about it. Of course, the top 4 need no explanation. They are the 4 best engaged supports in the game. Alistar has been the king of the support position over the course of the second half of the year. There has been no champion engage-wise, basically, across the map that has got nearly as much play as what Alistar offers. I think it's just because of the consistency. Again, if you're able to get that, you know, headbutt pulverize off, if you're able to kind of survive really long in a team fight, that's really all you need to do in that support position. That's really all that you're asking that champion to do, and there are very few champions that do it as well as Alistar. Now, is he the same kind of CC bot that someone like Nautilus can be if things go incredibly right? No, but is Alistar a little bit, I don't know, a little bit more flexible in terms of how he can play the early game and also a little bit more tanky? Honestly, right now, probably the tankiest support in the game outside of Braum. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of his strength. And so, for the most part, Alistar is probably still going to continue to be prioritized very highly, but, of course, Nautilus is still going to be on the list. Every time we have an engaged support meta, Nautilus is going to be near the top of it, and that is absolutely continued. Here, Nautilus is a CC bot. If, you know, through and through, first and foremost, that's what Nautilus does, is he continues to lock down whatever target you need to lock down. The ultimate's great, the hook is great, and just generally speaking, he's always going to be the highest priority hook champion so long as Thresh isn't in a position where he's completely busted because of the utility that Nautilus offers. Him and Alistar, I would expect to be the 2 most played supports in the game at Worlds. Then you've got Rell and Rakan. Rell, kind of that flex pick, still really strong. I think it's a little bit more, you know, versatile in the jungle at the moment, which is crazy because I kind of had the opposite opinion for most of the year, but I think I've kind of been proven wrong on that. Playoffs has been very eye-opening for how good Rell can be in the jungle, and I still think that, you know, Rell's very good in the support position. Your telegraphed engages aren't nearly as much of a problem if you're going to be roaming around, and I think that's kind of Rell's big positive. Similar thing to Rakan, which we'll get into, but, you know, Rell's going to do a very similar thing. She's not going to be able to create as much for all of her lanes because she's going to be in the bot lane for the most part, at least that's how people have been playing her. They haven't necessarily roamed nearly as much as they would, typically with something like a Rakan or a Pyke or something similar, but when you hit that mid game, you're looking at Rel as the primary engage threat, and most games are going to be determined whether or not Rel is ahead and whether or not Rel can land these major engages, and so if Rel is in the game, it's going to be a pretty big pick, and I think, with it being really good in the jungle and with it being really good in the support position, going to be really highly prioritized, even if it's not the most played support directly. And then Rakan's also really good, especially in certain pairings. I think Rakan just offers the most consistent form of engage, right? Alistar and Nautilus are great because they're super tanky, but if you're just looking to create plays and be this big playmaker, that's Rakan. Like, you want to go for something super aggressive in the mid game, that's Rakan, and that's going to be the role that he ends up filling. I'm not sure if he's going to get as much play as people are saying. I think he's probably third on the list for me, below Alistar and Nautilus in terms of those engaged supports, but again, he kind of fits into different compositions and fulfills a little bit of a different role. You can play aggressive on Alistar and Nautilus, but for the most part, you're going to see them lay back and be peel a little bit more often than you're going to see them be the primary and focal point initiator, especially if you've got something like a Sejuani or a Maokai on your team. Rakan is not that. Rakan is going to be diving the backline and is going to be someone that you really have to watch out for, so kind of just a difference in playstyles between those four, but all filling relatively similar roles. And then finally, we have Braum as the final support in this Tier 1. Braum is really good. I've been singing the praises of Braum all year long. I think that he has consistently overperformed my expectations for what he's able to offer as a support. He's able to consistently carry games. I know he doesn't necessarily carry in the same way that a lot of other champions you would expect to carry. Hell, even a lot of the other engaged supports, carry a little bit more flashy, in flashy ways, I should say, but you give a really good AD carry player a Braum, and all of a sudden, like, that AD carry just gets to take over the game, because the Braum sets everything up so easily. I think he definitely deserves to be in Tier 1 in terms of strength. Now, will he be prioritized nearly as much as the other four supports that are going to be listed in this section? Probably not. I don't think he's going to be the same kind of play rate that Alistar, Nautilus, Rel, and Rakan are, but I think in the games that he is played, I think he's going to show that he is just as valuable and just as important towards the team comp as the others. We've been seeing a rise in Braum in terms of popularity, and I would expect that to continue at Worlds. Big fan of that pick, and I really do hope it continues, but that's Tier 1. Moving into Tier 2, a little bit of a different, kind of thing as to what we've talked about. It's not so much like archetypes. These are really just the other three supports that I think are good right now, although Lulu in and of herself is an archetype, I guess. We'll kind of talk about her first. Enchanters are just, I still think they're in a good spot. I certainly don't think that they're bad, and especially if you want to go for some more hyper carry oriented bot laners where you're kind of looking at a solo carry, I think Lulu is still very, very good in that, kind of situation. Draven, I think Kog'Maw obviously really benefit from having a Lulu in those situations, and I think, whether it's Lulu as the main, enchanter, which we saw out of T1 a ton in the LCK playoffs, or whether it's Milio, who I still think is in a relatively fine spot, whether it's Janna or Soraka or whatever enchanter, I do think that there's going to be at least some play for them, specifically, like I said, out of teams like T1 that do like to play that style a bit more, but Lulu's probably going to be the poster child in the face of enchanters at the current moment for a good reason. And then Leona and Blitzcrank as kind of the other two kind of off strong engaged supports. Leona obviously is just kind of a worse Nautilus at the current moment, and it's fine. Like, Leona is fine. You can definitely play her. I certainly don't think it's, like, awful to play Leona, but I do think that you're almost always going to prioritize either Alistar or Nautilus first and foremost. You're really only going to go to Leona if you're not able to get one of those two. And then Blitzcrank is a champion that I think a lot of the supports that are specifically going to this tournament like to play. On comes to mind as somebody who obviously has pulled out the Blitzcrank a ton over the course of this year, but just a big playmaker if you want something that can be a little bit more, pick-oriented and, wants to be a little bit more active and aggressive. We talked about that a bit with Rakan, but if you really want to go in that direction, Blitzcrank is that, probably over something like Pyke at the current moment, which I think a lot of people would kind of look and see which one they would prefer. I think Blitz is in a definitely a good enough spot to see a significant amount of play at Worlds if teams wanted to go in that direction. But that's going to be it for support, and I really do think that it's a little bit more locked than maybe people would want it to be at the current moment. Bot lane in general, I think, has a very centralized meta, and I think support definitely, kind of follows that, if you will. Alright, but that is going to do it for my 2023 World Meta Report video. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. Put a lot of time into trying to research what people thought, but unfortunately the meta isn't quite as diverse as I think a lot of people want it to be. It's pretty diverse in terms of the picks, but it's a lot of the picks that we've seen over the course of this year. Not a lot of the changes have ended up mattering, but I do hope you guys enjoyed the video nonetheless. Of course, if you did, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. And of course, it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, there's going to be a lot more Worlds content coming out just in the next couple of days. We're going to be doing my top 20 players at the World Championships video, as well as, of course, my Worlds Primer, where I go over every single team at the tournament, every single player from those teams. I rank them all within their positions, and I rank all of the teams as well. There's no bigger in-depth guide of every team at the tournament than what I'm going to be offering on this channel. So if you're interested in that stuff, hit subscribe. It really does mean a lot to me, and I think you're going to enjoy the content. If you enjoyed this video, I promise you're going to enjoy the rest as well. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.